Names are at the... Committee will be in order. Chair requests that members clear the center aisle and the well. Committee will rise informally to receive a message.
The House will be in order. The Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed with an amendment, H.R. 514, to extend expiring provisions of the USA Patriot Act Improvement and Reauthorization Act of 2005, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
The committee will resume its sitting.
Chair would ask that members remove audible conversation so the committee may continue its work on this bill. Come to order. Members would remove audible conversation. Clerk will continue to read.
Title 4, page 33, line 1, Title 4, Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation. Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation, $9,710,998,000.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 162, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Quigley of Illinois.
The gentleman from Illinois will be recognized for 5 minutes, but first, if the gentleman will hold. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to offer an amendment that would reduce research and development spending at the Department of Defense by 10%. First inclination, we all know research and development is a good thing, but not when it begets wasteful spending. The continuing resolution before us makes deep cuts in non-defense discretionary spending. If we are truly serious about reducing our long-term deficits, we must look at the whole picture, and that picture includes defense. Non-defense discretionary compromises approximately 15% of federal spending. Meanwhile, defense spending compromises 20% of federal spending. We cannot ignore 1/5 of the budget. It is, as Mr. Admiral Mike Mullen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said, our national debt is our biggest national security threat. My amendment would cut a modest 10% from the Department of Defense's research and development budget. DoD's R&D spending has experienced more spending growth since 2001 than any other major DoD appropriation category. DoD's research, development, testing, and evaluation budget has increased 63% over the last 10 years, rising from $49.2 billion in FY 2001 to $80.2 billion in FY 2010. This is 33% more than the Cold War peak in real terms, even though today we face no traditional adversary comparable to the Soviet Union. Further, in 2009, R&D spending exceeded China's entire defense budget, the world's second largest, by $10.5 billion. Surely, as we look for places to balance the budget, and in light of the vast superiority of our R&D budget, we can afford to reduce spending by 10%. A number of fiscal commissions and watchdog groups agree that DoD research and development should be cut, and proposed a number of proposals to reduce this development. The Sustainable Defense Task Force, a panel of defense experts from across the political spectrum, recently recommended requiring DoD to set its priorities and reduce R&D spending by $5 billion per year over 10 years. Additionally, the Cato Institute and the Task Force for Unified Security Budget agree research and development could be significantly improved without harming security and in order to achieve savings. The Fiscal Savings and the Bipartisan Policy Center have also put forward proposals to reduce research and development costs. The Fiscal Commission proposes reducing DoD's R&D budget by 10% for a savings of $7 billion in 2015, pointing out this reduction would leave DoD with a level above the peak of the Reagan years in real dollars. The Fiscal Commission cites several ongoing projects that they could be reduced or even canceled in order to reduce R&D costs. These programs include the Marine Corps version of the F-35, which has been put on a 2-year probation period by Secretary Gates for continued technical problems, cost overruns, and delays. The Bipartisan Policy Center offers a similar plan, calling for reduced funding of R&D proportional to the reduction in size of forces, or 18.5%. Reduction in R&D would be possible, argues the Bipartisan Policy Center, as we withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan and reduce our forces abroad. Such a reduction in R&D will impose greater discipline in research investments while continuing to budget significantly more resources than any other country's R&D. A cut in our defense R&D is also enabled by new security threats we face. Secretary Gates has called for a reorientation of our national security strategy, with a greater focus on counterinsurgency warfare rather than traditional warfare. This reorientation calls for investment in intelligence gathering, devices to sense improvised explosive devices, and investments in lower-cost machines such as drones, and will allow us to move away from the more expensive development of major weapon systems. We must reduce our deficit, and we must reduce our spending. But in doing so, we must put everything on the table and cut anywhere waste exists. Mr. Speaker, there is a universe of thought that less government is best, and that government can do almost nothing right. That thought ends at the Department of Defense. There are those who believe they can do no wrong. They have Department of Defense blinders on, which blind them from the fact that if we're going to make these cuts and we're going to face the very real threats that these debt and deficits will create for us, we have to cut across all lines. Thank you, and I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I would say to the House that first, in the $14.8 billion that the subcommittee recommended, which is in this bill, a reduction in the defense budget, a very large amount of that was reducing the research and development program. But you can't reduce research and development too much. I don't care what the best weapon system you have, or that you're planning on having, or that you have in the process, in the conceptual stage even. It never gets to where the soldier and the sailor and the airman and the Marine needs it. without research and development that make it possible and feasible to build it and deploy it. We've already cut a substantial amount out of R&D. We can't put a soldier on the battlefield, and if his system that he's working with doesn't work, we can't recall it, like you can an automobile or a medicine or a pill or something like that. It's got to work. I don't want to see an American trooper on the front line, whether he's on the ground, whether he's in the air, whether he's on the sea, whether he's under the sea, that has a failed system because we failed to properly research it during the development stage. So I understand that there are some who would cut the fence just to cut the fence. If you're going to reduce the defense budget, it ought to be a good reason. There is not a good reason for reducing this account. We have already reduced the defense part $14.8 billion, and I just hope that nobody is tempted to vote for this just because it's a cut. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. What purpose, gentleman from Virginia, rise?
I rise to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, similar to the small business innovation research, this is actually one of the very most important things we can be doing within the defense budget. But not just for our military, not just for national security, but equally for our national economy. This is the line item that funded the Internet. The whole concept of the Internet came from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is funded in this category of the defense budget: research, development, testing, and evaluation. Imagine what the Internet has meant to the American economy, let alone the world. Look what just happened in Egypt, ultimately because of the Internet. The GPS system that we have in our vehicles, we take it for granted now. Where'd it come from? The RDT&E account in the Defense Department. This is what we want to cut out? The unmanned aerial vehicles. You know, the drones, the most effective warfighting weapon we have right now that doesn't put our soldiers' lives at risk, but is maximally effective and targeted, RDT&E, defense research, the energy research account. We're making enormous strides in that area. Precision targeting. That was innovation within this account. That's what gives us our cutting edge. That's why we have the most effective defense capability in the world, but it's also one of the reasons why we have the strongest economy in the world. There's no other area of research that means as much as to this economy. And frankly, it means a great deal to the entire world's economy. Now, the National Institutes of Health, we do wonderful research there. But the spin-off to the private sector is not as extensive as the spin-off from the research we do within the Defense Department. My gosh, well, of course, I guess it's a good thing we get these amendments because it gives us an opportunity to explain to the American people, particularly the taxpayer, what they're getting for their money, where these ideas come from. And many of them come from the Defense Department. It's because of the investment we have made in research, development, testing, and evaluation. So I obviously would urge unanimous rejection of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Those opposed to the amendment will say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Clerk will read.
Page 33, line 11, Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation, Navy, $17,961,303,000 to remain available for obligation until September 30th, 2012.
For what purpose, gentleman from Florida, rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk. It's Amendment 2.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Rooney of Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my amendment striking funding for an extra engine for the F-35 fighter jet to immediately save the American taxpayers $450 million. It is dubious why Congress continues to fund a program that the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Department of Defense adamantly state they do not want. Just today, Defense Secretary Robert Gates called the program, quote, an unnecessary and extravagant expense, and stated that this money is needed for higher priority defense efforts. As we decide which cuts to make in our defense, one that won't hurt our troops today, this should be at the top of the list. Mr. Speaker, the American people sent us here to change the way that Washington works. This amendment is a perfect opportunity to show your constituents that business as usual in Washington is over. I urge my colleagues to follow through with their promises, to listen to the voters as to why they sent us here, and to vote to strike the funding for this expensive and unnecessary program. Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
I move to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. During the debate to strike funding for the F-35 competitive engine, you're likely to hear many statements that just don't square with the facts in the program. Just today I've heard that it has been stated that the primary engine for the F-35 aircraft has in one case 200,000 flight test hours. Another statement said 20,000 test hours. The reality is the F-35 primary engine has, as of the end of 2010, just 680 flight test hours and has 90% of its flight testing to go. You're also likely to hear that there are almost 30 U.S. military aircraft that operate with a sole source engine. That's interesting. The F-35 aircraft is a single engine aircraft. No fighter aircraft engine has ever been required to do what the F-35 engine is required to do, provide powered flight and also power a lift fan for the short takeoff and vertical landing F-35B. In fact, this challenging act of physics has just resulted in the F-35B being put on probation by the Secretary of Defense, requiring redesign of the F-35B unique engine components. The current estimate to complete development of the F-135, the primary engine, has been extended several years, and the estimated cost to complete the development program is 450% above the February 2008 estimated completion cost. In fact, only 2 U.S. operational aircraft are single-engine aircraft, the Air Force F-16 and the Marine Corps AV-8B. The F-35 is scheduled to replace these aircraft, which will not be operational until at least 2016. The F-16 was the first aircraft to use an alternate engine, beginning in the mid-'80s, and still does so today. Accident rates have trended from 14 mishaps per 100,000 flight hours in 1980 with the Pratt & Whitney engine, when the alternative engine program was first funded, to less than just 2 mishaps per 100,000 flight hours in 2009 for both the Pratt & Whitney and GE engines. A review of the AV-8B accident data last year indicated accident rate 6 times that of the other Navy fighter aircraft, the FA-18, and over 3.5 times the rate of the F-16. The AV-8B will be replaced by the F-35B. So while the alternative engine F-16 has benefited from competition, with an accident rate having declined by a factor of 7, the AV-8B has an accident rate 3.5 times that of the F-16. Some will cite that the F-136, that's the competitive engine, will require $2.9 billion over 6 years to make it competition ready. It's interesting to note that the cost increase in the contract for the current primary engine, the 135, is $3.4 billion, and that does not include other government costs, independent research and development, and component improvement program funding. The entire remaining development of the F-35 competitive engine could have been funded with the overrun to date in the F-35 primary engine. Further, the GAO has found that key assumptions in the cost to go for the F-35 competitive engine were unnecessarily pessimistic based on historic experience with the original alternative energy program. One of our colleagues has said that the F-35 primary engine is 5 to 7 years ahead of the F-136 alternate engine in development. This is not the case at all. First, the acquisition strategy for the F-35 competitive engine called for it to begin 4 years after the primary engine. The Pentagon told us last April that the competitive engine was only 2 to 3 months behind schedule of the original plan. At the same time, the Pentagon notified the committee the F-135 primary engine was 24 months behind the schedule set in the original October 01 contract. In other words, had both engines begun at the same time, the alternative engine would now be almost 2 years ahead of the primary engine. I don't know why there is such confusion over the facts related to this issue. Our committee has followed this issue for over 15 years, and we ask you to support the F-35 competitive engine program as an important element to controlling F-35 program costs and future force readiness. The GAO has looked at the competitive engine programs. They have noted that historically the competitive engine always does two things. It makes the engines cheaper and it makes them better. Notice the accident rate that I noted earlier. Furthermore, this new aircraft is supposed to be ultimately 95% of all of the aircraft in all of our services. Can you imagine what would happen if there was a problem with the engine and we had to stand down? We'd have essentially no fighter aircraft in any of our services. It is essential we continue with the alternative engine. I hope not just to continue with this development to make the primary engine better and cheaper, but to provide a second energy for duplication. Thank you, and I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose, gentleman from Colorado rise? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, it is time to end the Joint Strike Fighter second engine mistake. In 2001, the GE engine lost in procurement competition to the one designated by Pratt & Whitney. A sole source development contract was signed in 2005. But since 1997, Congress has provided for a Joint Strike Fighter alternative engine program. This continuing resolution includes $450 million for the alternate engine in the Joint Strike Fighter. According to the Pentagon, the second engine's cost is close to $2.9 billion. The Department of Defense is clear. In their view, our military and the taxpayers are best served by not pursuing a second engine. There are more pressing Department of Defense priorities. There is just no guarantee that having two engines will create enough long-term savings to outweigh the near-term cost of nearly $3 billion. The risk from a single engine is reasonable and consistent with past acquisitions. A single engine is not a new approach and does not create dangerous levels of risk. We currently have two current aircraft programs, the F-22 and the F-18, which both utilize a single engine provider. Additional cost and the burden of maintaining two logistical systems are not offset by the potential savings generated through competition. We are not making procurement decisions in a vacuum. If we had all the money in the world, maybe an alternate engine would be a good idea, but we don't. We have a deficit of $1.5 trillion and a debt of $14 trillion, and all our funding choices must acknowledge that. I urge support for the Romney amendment. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose, gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I can understand that there are a lot of jobs at stake. There's politics, there's regional economies, and so on, to be considered in this issue. I don't particularly have a dog in the hunt, but I'd like to share with you why I disagree with the amendment. why I think it's in the national interest to have an alternative engine. The experience that we had in the 1980s with the F-16 engine, it seems to me, should inform this debate. We had a sole source contract, basically, a single engine for the F-16. It was way over budget and outside of the schedule, any reasonable schedule, really. Production was substantially delayed, and we had very little leverage until we brought in an alternative contractor. We brought in competition. All of a sudden, we got right on schedule and on budget. And I think this situation is analogous. We're talking about a $100 billion contract. The principal jet fighter we're going to have for the next generation. And we have one engine manufacturer that we're going to be reliant upon. It's also going to be one of our most substantial exports to other militaries around the world. It's going to be a very substantial source of jobs and revenue and, in fact, I have to say, military dominance. What we're talking about is having competition. Ensure that we get the best bang for the buck for the taxpayers. And in fact, the General Accounting Office has estimated that over the long run, we will save money through this competition. That's why the vast majority of the Armed Services Committee and the Defense Appropriations Committee have decided, after a great deal of deliberation, that we need competition in this program. If it was not such a major program, if it was not so expensive, a $100 billion source contract, maybe it wouldn't have mattered. But we are so dependent upon one manufacturer. It was basically the consensus of the Authorizing and Appropriations Committees that we should look to two manufacturers to compete against each other and to give the American taxpayer the greatest bang for the buck, the most effective and most efficient jet fighter that we can possibly produce. I think we all agree we believe in the principle of competition. When you have monopoly control, invariably, and it doesn't mean that anybody's at fault, but invariably, you slack off a little bit. It's okay to bump your numbers up a little bit, perhaps. But when you have to compete with somebody else, you're always looking at the bottom line, always wanting a higher quality, a less expensive weapon, product. That's what this debate is all about. It's about a basic fundamental principle of the American economy, competition. For that reason, I would oppose the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Jim yields back. For what purpose, gentleman from Missouri rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does the gentleman move? The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
This is a debate and discussion that's been going on for some period of time, and as has been noted before, there are many of us who serve on the Armed Services Committee and have a little different view than the Pentagon on this subject. So what are the benefits of the second engine? Several of those have been mentioned. First of all, it's the sense of security. You've got basically an aircraft now that's going to be serving the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Air Force. All of our services will be dependent on this one aircraft, which is the Joint Strike Fighter. And that particular Joint Strike Fighter has one engine. Obviously, if you want it to work well, the engine has to run right. And so the Armed Services Committees have taken a look at this, and those with a few more whiskers here understand the problem that came along on the F-16, where we had an engine manufacturer that couldn't get the engine done, and the whole airframe was at risk. In this case, you have the airframe for three of the Marines, the Navy, and the Air Force, and so this Congress wisely decided that we're going to have two engines. Now, so first of all, from a security point of view, what this allows us to do is to make sure that we have an engine that's on time and on delivery. certainly the competition is another good point. You save a lot of money if you've got two different contractors bidding against each other. We're going to get a good price on the engines, and that's going to be important, particularly year in and year out. Now, there are a couple of other things that have not been mentioned that I've heard this evening. One of them is that the second engine also has 10 to 15% more thrust. What does that mean? Well, it's interesting. If you happen to be a Marine Corps guy, the Marine version of this is called a stovall. It has to take off from just sitting on a deck, and it takes off straight up. That takes a lot of thrust. The first engine is absolutely maxed out. And what we see over time is we want to put more stuff on our airplanes. And when you do that, it gets heavier and you need more thrust. The second engine offers that 10 to 15% more thrust. I don't know if there's a financial consideration to define what's that worth, but that extra 10 or 15% could make the difference of a stable aircraft that can carry some particular additional piece of equipment that we may need in the future. The other point that I've not heard made, and is actually kind of new to us, and that is these engines are big suckers. They are very, very big turbines, and they have a tremendous amount of power that they're generating. Now, if we've got this one turbine that works for the Marines, for the Navy, and the Air Force, what would happen if we were to use that turbine in other applications? You get all the more benefit of having fewer parts and having interchangeability. These engines are bolt-for-bolt interchangeable. And so what happens when we start to look at the design for a future deep strike bomber? The question on that will be, one of the questions would be, how many engines do you need? Is it going to be a 4-engine bomber or a 2-engine? 4 is a lot more expensive. What happens if you could get the power of 2 engines into one and make it a 2-engine bomber and use the same engines that are going into JSFs? So now you've got a universal engine working for a number of platforms. A whole lot of simplicity and cost savings for that type of thing. So if we're going to put our eggs in one basket, we want to make sure we've got at least 2 people, and we have the competition, the capability of using this engine in other ways, and the additional thrust for the second engine. I would recommend a no vote on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose, gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as a ranking subcommittee member of the House Armed Services Committee and a strong supporter of the Joint Strike Fighter Competitive Engine Program, I rise today in opposition to this amendment. 3 basic reasons. The competitive engine program, first, will save billions in taxpayer dollars. Secondly, it will create thousands of jobs. And third, it is imperative to our national security. I think all 3 of these are issues that all of us share a bipartisan concern about. I'm pleased, in fact, to join both the Armed Services Committee chairman and the ranking member of the full committee, as well as many of my colleagues from both sides of the aisle, Democratic and Republican, in supporting this competitive program for the alternative engine. First, contrary to what you may have heard, the competitive engine program is about saving billions of dollars in taxpayer money. Competition does drive down costs, it does raise quality, and ensures responsiveness from the manufacturers. With the JSF program being the largest defense program in our nation's history, we have to make sure that we have that competition to get the best quality and the lowest price. Striking funding for a competitive engine will give a 30-year, $100 billion monopoly to a sole contractor. Funding the F-136 engine, however, will allow 2 companies to compete head-to-head, resulting in the best price and the best engine. In fact, GAO studies have indicated that competition from the F-136 engine will actually save taxpayers $21 billion over the life of the Joint Strike Fighter program. Secondly, the competitive engine program is about saving jobs. Currently, there are 2,500 U.S. jobs supporting the development of the alternative engine. Once full production occurs, the number would rise to 4,000. Third, the competitive engine program is about national security. Without a competitive engine, U.S. and allied forces will be dependent entirely upon one engine for 90% of our fighter jet fleets. One small problem could ground the entire fleet, which is something that none of us would want. This program is not about favoring one particular contractor over another. It is about having strong bipartisan support for competition, for creating jobs, and for national security, and for saving taxpayer money. In fact, this was demonstrated when this was voted upon last year, when we had 116 Republicans and 115 Democrats, that's about as even as you can get, vote for the funding of the Alternative Competitive Program. For these reasons, I strongly oppose this amendment and rise in support of saving $21 billion in taxpayer money, creating jobs, and ensuring our national security through the Alternative Engine Competitive Program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose, gentleman from California rise?
Strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move in opposition. I stand in opposition to this amendment for a few reasons, not any as eloquent as the ones that have already been stated, but some fairly simple reasons, I think. Number one, what if one of us here, one of us members, a congressman, earmarked a $100 billion project today? I think there would be outcry from all over if it was one of us that did this. If we said that we're going to give this one job worth $100 billion to one company. We don't do that anymore, and there's a reason we don't do it anymore. It's because it leads to corruption, and it leads to people doing things that they should not be doing. We shouldn't give the DOD the same, let's call it temptations, to have to give a $100 billion contract to one company. Number two, competition. Now, to see how things have switched, where you have folks that have been talking about business, now saying that competition is going to bring quality down and bring cost up. That's not what competition does, Mr. Chairman. What competition does is bring quality up and bring cost down. I think that there is definitely bipartisan agreement on that. And number three, I served in Afghanistan on my third tour, and when I was over there about midway through in 2007, an F-18 went down. It went down here stateside. And the reason it went down, it had a cracked wing. And what we didn't know at that time is if that was an inherent flaw in the F-18 structure. So what we did in Afghanistan is we shut down all F-18 flights. In fact, the world over, F-18 flights were shut down until we could figure out if this problem was inherent in all F-18s or if it's just one problem for that one particular F-18. If this happens with the F-35, with just one engine, we're going to ground the free world's new jet. That's what will be grounded, because the F-35 is being sold to other countries. It's being used by all of our services, except for the Army. And if it goes down and we have to stop flight for it, it could put people in harm's way. That's why this is frankly not a money issue or a jobs issue. This is an issue of operational risk. You should have a backup engine for the main engine, for the main fighter for this nation and other nations going forward. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back. From what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to participate in this debate. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. Mr. Chairman, I don't have a dog in this fight.
Yes, somebody take my place.
Neither of the two fine companies that are arguing over this has jobs in my district that I'm aware of. I'm involved in this argument because I have thousands of service personnel who serve our country, and I have hundreds of thousands of taxpayers who pay for the government of our country. And I am convinced that the right answer for our service personnel and for our taxpayers is to oppose this amendment. We have heard many good reasons. I think the ones that stand out the most are these. As the Chair well knows, he and I were given the privilege and responsibility of looking at defense procurement across the board over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. And something very rare happened when the gentleman, the Chair, and I worked on this. We produced two pieces of legislation that passed the House essentially unanimously. And in that process of Democrat and Republican working together, we learned something very disturbing, and that was that in major weapons systems, costs had skyrocketed by $296 billion over what they were supposed to cost, and the delay in fielding these systems had gone from an average of 16 months behind to 22 months behind. That was very unwelcome news. In the course of conducting that analysis, we also learned something that I think most Americans know intuitively. When you have more choice and you have more competition, you get a better result. I think most of us, when we've had to buy a household appliance or a car, go out and get a couple of quotes. We have people compete against each other so we get the best deal. That very common sense concept is the core argument in front of us this evening. And I think the burden would be on those who say we shouldn't have competition and those who say that the status quo would be okay if we had only one contractor. Now, the other point that I want to make beyond money is about the operational capacity of our armed forces. The United States enjoys the blessing of military superiority this evening, I think, for two essential reasons. The first and most important one is the quality of the young men and women who volunteer to serve us. Without question, that's the most important reason. But the second, I believe, is our superiority in the air, our ability in any corner of the globe to establish dominance over the battle space by virtue of the quality of our air assets. The operability of those air assets, as Mr. Hunter just mentioned a few minutes ago, is at risk if we are dependent upon one supply chain, one manufacturing process, one set of parts, and one set of solutions to a problem. You always want to have a plan B. This would be a difficult call if having that plan B operationally cost us more money. But it isn't a difficult call because the opposite is true. Having the plan B, having the option, saves money for the American taxpayer. The GAO has estimated about $21 billion over time because of the merits and benefits of choice and competition. We have two fine enterprises involved with these engines, and I think what we ought to do is create a system where each flourishes. Not because of the benefits of the job creation that will occur, oh, that's certainly a welcome benefit, but because operationally this is the best way to support those who serve us. This is the best way to avoid putting them at risk because of operational defects, and because the benefits and merits of competition over time will reduce pressure on our taxpayers to the tune of $21 billion. I thank the Chair for his collegial work on this subject, and I would urge members to defeat this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. Are we swapping? He said they were going to. Okay.
I'm not sure why.
What purpose the gentleman from Florida rise? Mr. Chairman, I move that the House do not rise. The committee do not rise. Questions on the motion? In favor say aye. All opposed say no. Ayes have it. Committee rises.
So it's Mr. Speaker now?
We didn't move it last time. What he reads?
I just have to file this rule.
Okay.
We're going to now consider tomorrow at noon.
Chairman. Mr. Speaker, Committee of the Whole House, State of the Union, having under consideration H.R. 1, directs me to report that it's become to no resolution thereupon.
The Chairman of the Committee on the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 1 and has come to no resolution thereon.
Stay right there. I don't want you to budge one.
I can't move.
What purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
Clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 93, Resolution providing for consideration of the Senate amendment to the bill, H.R. 514, to extend expiring provisions of the USA Patriot Improvement and Reauthorization Act of 2005 and Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 relating to access to business records, individual terrorists as agents of foreign powers, and roving wiretaps until December 8, 2011.
Referred to House calendar and ordered printed. Pursuant to House Resolution 92 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 1. Will the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, kindly resume the chair?
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the House of the State of the Union for the further consideration of Bill H.R. 1, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Department of Defense and the other departments and agencies of the government for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2011, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose earlier today, pending Amendment Number 2, offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rooney, on the table. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. Mr. Chairman, as we debate the funding of a competing engine for the Joint Strike Fighter program, there are a few key points that we should keep in mind. First, competition has long been the best way to control costs on large defense programs, and competition is the centerpiece of acquisition reform. By funding competing engines for the Joint Strike Fighter, we can save $21 billion. Let me repeat that, $21 billion savings in taxpayer money over time, according to the Government Accountability Office. Beyond the GAO's projections, our recent history demonstrates that competition also leads to a more efficient process, quicker innovation, and better contractor responsiveness. Recently, the Independent Quadrennial Defense Panel concluded, and I quote, "History has shown that the only reliable source of price reduction through the life of a program is competition between dual services," unquote. Additionally, the absence of competition makes it harder to address the issues that inevitably arise in connection with sophisticated and critical technology such as jet engines. Mr. Chairman, we are seeing such issues on the lead engine for the Joint Strike Fighter. Pratt & Whitney was designated to power the JSF aircraft under the theory that it could effectively derive an engine from its engine for the F-22. Unfortunately, it wasn't as easy as they had anticipated. As a result, the lead engine for the Joint Strike Fighter is now billions of dollars over budget, and worse, struggling to perform the critical functional requirements for the aircraft. I quote directly from the GAO report from March 2010, quote, "The Pratt engine is now estimated to cost about $7.3 billion, a 50% increase over the original contract award. The total projected cost increased $800 million in 2008 alone. Engine development cost increases primarily resulted from higher costs for labor and materials, supplier problems, and the rework needed to correct deficiencies with an engine blade during redesign. Engine test problems have also slowed development." That's unquote. The GAO further confirmed an additional total project cost increase of $1.2 billion in 2010 alone to cover higher than expected engine costs, tooling, and other items. And on February 11, 2011, yet another cost overrun on the lead engine was announced, this time totaling at least $1 billion, bringing total cost overruns on the lead engine to an astounding $3.5 billion today. The Department of Defense says we don't need a second engine, but these issues won't fix themselves. Only competition will help control costs and create a better, more efficient process. I ask you, how can we not afford to invest in a competing engine? Bottom line, having the engine makers fight head-to-head will give us a far more capable, more cost-effective Joint Strike Fighter. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut rise? Gentleman's
You got strike last word.
Move to strike. Final
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the gentleman from Florida's amendment, and as a fellow member of the House Armed Services Committee, I just want to share at least some of the ad nauseum length of input that we've had at the Armed Services Committee over the last 2 or 3 years talking about this issue. We have had the benefit of hearing from the warfighters, the heads of the various branches that are dealing with this program, whether it's the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, and they have repeatedly over the last 2 or 3 years stated that there is no justification for this wasteful spending, which, again, both the President and the Secretary of Defense have also supported. On the Sea Power Subcommittee, which I serve on, Admiral Roughead, the CNO, head of the Navy, talked about the disastrous operational impact of having 2 engines would have in terms of our aircraft carriers. As he stated, one can look at a carrier and see a very large ship, but when that ship is deployed, we have things packed in almost every nook and cranny in order to provide that reliability and responsiveness. So having to stock 2 different types of engines is just not practical for us. It would be totally unrealistic to have a situation where the F-35B and the F-35C, which are the planes which will land on our aircraft carriers, have to fly in with 2 separate engines that would require 2 separate systems of maintenance and repair. And the notion, which was stated earlier by one of the prior speakers, that they are somehow interchangeable, well, if we're going to have interchangeability, then we may as well just have 1 engine system, which is in fact what we have today in terms of the F-18 Super Hornets, which land on aircraft carriers every day of the year. It is 1 engine supplier which provides the engines for those Super Hornets, GE, and good for them. And as Admiral Roughead said, he really doesn't care which engine it is, but the Navy needs to have only 1 system in order for them to be operational on the 11 aircraft carriers that today make up a key component of our national defense. One person on the committee sort of suggested the fact that, well, maybe a way to solve that problem would be to have GE aircraft carriers and Pratt & Whitney aircraft carriers, which, again, kind of, I think, highlights the absurdity of the notion that you're going to have 2 separate engine systems on these vessels, which every square inch is precious. Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot of talk about competition. I'm sure there's going to be lots of rebuttal about the fact that there was a competition which led into the selection of the Pratt & Whitney engine. But what I would just end with is that competition is one thing, redundancy and waste is another. We do not have 2 of everything in terms of our procurement systems. We did not have 2 engines for Black Hawk helicopters. We did not have 2 engines for F-18s or our ships. We don't have 2 nuclear reactor systems for our submarines or our aircraft carriers. We don't have separate engines, 2 separate engines for our destroyers. I mean, the fact of the matter is you have to make decisions sometimes in order to achieve efficiency, and that's where we are today with the F-35 program. The notion that we are going to add $3 billion to production costs by having a separate alternate engine and all of the rippling effects of operational headaches, which Admiral Roughead eloquently described before the Armed Services Committee, is just not something that our military can afford today. We have reached a tipping point in terms of our military budgets. We have got to focus on effective, efficient use of resources to help the warfighter and to advance our national security, and having a bloated, wasteful system of an alternate engine, which is the way the Washington Post described this program, is not the way to achieve that goal. And I strongly support this amendment and urge my colleagues to pass this amendment for a cost-effective, efficient use of our resources for our national defense. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose is the gentlelady from Ohio? Gentlewoman was recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. This is the wrong way to go at our critical hour of need. You know, Congress has consistently provided funding for the development of the alternative engine because Congress knows full well the benefits of competition in weapons acquisition and procurement. You know, last session, we passed the Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act of 2009. 411 to 0 in favor. And in fact, our Senate colleagues agreed with 95 to 0. If there is such overwhelming bipartisan agreement in both chambers on the need for competition in weapons systems acquisition, then why are we taking a vote to eliminate competition for the propulsion system that is going to power 95% of our tactical fighter fleet over the next 40 years? Section 202 of the Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act clearly states the Secretary of Defense shall ensure that the acquisition strategy for each major defense acquisition program includes measures to ensure competition throughout the life cycle of such program. The Joint Strike Fighter is the Department of Defense's largest procurement program. The Department of Defense plan calls for acquiring nearly 2,500 Joint Strike Fighters. Hundreds of additional F-35s are expected to be purchased by U.S. allies. If the propulsion system that powers nearly 3,000 tactical jet fighters is not major defense acquisition, then I'm not sure what qualifies. Passing this amendment will hand Pratt & Whitney a $100 billion monopoly on a 30-year contract that has never been competitively bid. Proponents of this amendment will argue that Pratt & Whitney won the engine competition when Lockheed was awarded the contract to develop the Joint Strike Fighter. Not so fast. Last May, Mr. John Roth from the Office of the Undersecretary of Comptroller and Mr. Mike Sullivan, the Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management of the GAO, both testified before the House Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs that the competition was done at the contractor level and that the engines were never actually competed. The point of all this, Mr. Speaker, is that the engine competition never occurred, and it is disingenuous to argue that Pratt & Whitney has already won. The fact is that providing funds for the competition of alternative engines will ultimately drive down cost, improve product quality and contractor responsiveness, drive technological innovation, and ensures that taxpayer dollars are not wasted. History shows that competing engines can result in significant long-term savings. The Great Engine War saved the F-16 program 21% in overall costs, according to the 2007 GAO report. This represents $20 billion in savings for the lifetime of the Joint Strike Fighter engine program. Additionally, the alternative engine team, represented by GE and Rolls-Royce, offered the Department of Defense a fixed-priced contract. Their offer saves $1 billion in the first 5 years and puts cost overruns at the risk of the contractor. This is an unprecedented move in major defense acquisition. Finally, providing for a competitive alternate engine will serve as a hedge against operational risk and ensure that a fighter that makes up 95% of our tactical fleet is not grounded due to engine failures. Fully funding the alternative engine is not only prudent risk management, but an acknowledgement of the fundamental responsibility that Congress has to protect and provide the most reliable equipment to our men and women in uniform. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this ill-guided amendment. It will not save taxpayers money in the long run. I'm not even sure it's really going to save them money in the short run, and I yield back my time.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. For what purpose the gentleman from Connecticut rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the amendment by Tom Rooney of Florida. Let me commend my colleague from Florida first and foremost, and those that have joined him in this amendment. At the President's State of the Union message, there was a symbolic gesture in this chamber for us to sit together. And we did. And we talked about the camaraderie and the need to reach out and work together. I applaud my colleague for his strong stance and his willingness to work bipartisanly to do what the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the Secretary of Defense, the Bush administration and the Obama administration have asked Congress to do. End this wasteful, duplicative spending. There are new members that have come to Congress on both sides with new zeal and the ability to perhaps look outside the Beltway at what people have to experience on a regular basis. And they scratch their heads in awe of what seems to be a common-sense proposal by the Bush administration, by the Obama administration, by the Air Force, by the Marines, and by the Navy. And that's to end this wasteful spending. We've heard great talk about competition. My God, I'm all for competition. I don't think there isn't a person here who isn't for competition. 2 engines. Why not 3? Why not 4? It would be better overall for our industrial base, but the people on the committee know the hard truth, as do all of Americans. We've seen it. I fault no one for support of the interest of their state or their district or their employees. But let's be honest about this. We're going to have to make priorities. I've witnessed it in the C-17 and the F-22. And there comes a time when you recognize that we need these precious dollars. There has to be cuts. Both sides have acknowledged, and again, I want to compliment my colleagues on the other side for the zeal that they have come here with to say, listen, the Pentagon isn't sacrosanct either. And we have to make these cuts. And here's the Secretary of Defense pleading yesterday at a conference saying, please, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force do not want this engine. Look, competition is great. But let's look at some of the facts here that have been cited as well. If you have 86% of the market currently, and you're seeking to get 92% of it, where does competition lie? With a company that has 86%? I don't think so. And I think anyone who looks at this from a common sense perspective comes to that understanding, comes to that difficult decision that has to be made with respect to the nation's deficit. Now, Mr. Rooney has proposed that this money go directly into a lockbox to deal with the nation's deficit. There are a lot of good proposals where to use money, but that's what he's proposed. I submit, as a Democrat who would like to see the money going to COPS funding, to make sure that LIHEAP funding gets there, that these are the kinds of compromises and decisions that we have to make. And this is what's right for the country. We have to address this deficit. And if we have our leadership, the Bush administration and their Pentagon, the Obama administration, you heard Joe Courtney talk about Admiral Rupphouse again saying today the absurdity involved in this argument. It doesn't matter what companies, what matters is this country.